We are switching to poetry this week, and four poems that deal with themes that we've seen before. Um, so, the Romantics, in particular, were known for writing poems about nature, but also about the human condition, and they grappled often with issues including mortality and legacy, or what we leave behind. Keats, the first poet on our list this week, marked a shift in Romantic poetry from the first generation, or the Lake poets, to the second generation of Romantics. And he's considered now to be the poet of sensuous beauty. He struggled in his short life to make sense of a contradiction between the world's beauty and its competing pain and ugliness. And in his poems ask how a world that produced so much that was vulgar could also produce so much beauty and delight. And this is where many of his poems reside. So Keats wasn't simply a poet of sensuality and gorgeous images. He was also controversial. He sided with Leigh Hunt's radical views. He rejected neoclassical formalism, and he was often attacked as the Cockney poet, which is a term that many reviews of his poetry used. Now, one reason Keats endures today is that his poems feature universal ideals about the human condition rather than transitory ones or political ones. His poetry inspired the Art for Art's Sake movement that was celebrated by the Preraphielites, by Oscar Wilde, after his death, and many find it hard not to speculate what Keats might have done had he lived past the age of 25. His letters give us some possible clues to understanding what we encounter in his poems. And these letters were published after his death and were initially thought to be a distraction from his poetry, but recently there's been a lot of attention paid to these letters. For example, the Keats Letter Project publishes each letter individually, written across 200 years to the date after its publication, so to kind of bring the letters back into the spotlight. In one letter, Keats coins a term called negative capability. And by negative capability, he actually defines this term as when man is capable of being in uncertainty, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Now, this is not an easy place to remain, particularly if we're someone in the sciences or we're someone who values reason and want to know the answer. This is often a state of confusion that he's encouraging readers to embrace. It's welcomed because it allows readers to interpret text for themselves, something that all of you in this class have been doing each week. So this state is something that will allow us to eventually reach something greater than fact and reason if we sit with it. Another term that is important in this in Keats's works is the chameleon poet, and this is something he's going to reject in the first generation of Romantics, William Wordsworth, who was often accused of the egotistical sublime, where the poet was everywhere. Keats, however, defines this new kind of anti egotistical sublime like this. He says, and this is what he believes poetry should be. He says, "It is not itself, it has no self. It is everything and nothing. It has no character. It enjoys light and shade. It lives in gusto, be it foul or fair, high or low, right or poor, mean or elevated." These types of this type of language to describe the poet is really important, because the shift that's happening here is putting the emphasis on reading poetry through our own lens. So the idea that I get something quite different out of reading a poem than the person next to me is something that Keats is embracing. And so when we get to a poem like "When I have fears, then I may cease to be," we have this sort of, the first thing we need to kind of think about is how the poem is written. So this is a sonnet, but it's also a Shakespearean sonnet. And the reason this matters so that Shakespearean sonnets are divided into 3 quatrains, or 4-line stanzas, and each of those develops a single theme around, in this particular case, mortality and death and coming to terms with what we leave behind. In this case, the poet's legacy. But he's also written poems that were quite forceful about the idea that he would haunt us from the grave through his poetry. Something you might write about if you choose to write about this poem is the question about what he's talking about when he refers to his pen and his teeming brain. What is this comparison he's making here? And what does he mean by the huge cloudy symbols of high romance? There are a couple of kind of ambiguities in the poem. For example, what does the speaker do when he realizes he can never look upon the person thee is not named? It could be Fanny Brawne, whom he loved, but was never able to marry because he did not have the money to do so. And so this could be something you look at in your post this week. Keats was also surrounded by death much of his life. He caught a bad cold in 1818, and he was unable to leave the Isle of Mull. But when he returned, he nursed his brother Tom, who had tuberculosis, and he actually exposed himself to the infection. They call it the, quote, family disease, but consumption was not identified as a disease until 1820, and there was a considerable degree of stigma attached to this condition. It was associated with weakness, and Keats refuses to actually name consumption in his letters. His brother would die on the 1st of December 1818, and this was something that affected the way he looked at mortality and the rest of his remaining years. So with I have fears, when I have fears, then I may cease to be, the final lines are extremely important in terms of thinking about how you understand his view of death, of leaving the world and what we leave behind. Then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. A question you might want to ask in your post is whether he sees writing as a way to remain alive and affecting his readers beyond the grave. Keats's tombstone reads, "This grave contains all that was mortal of a young English poet who on his deathbed in the bitterness of his heart at the malicious power of his enemies desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone." And the words are actually referring to the negative reviews of Keats's work in his lifetime. These changed clearly after his death. "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." If you're thinking of this sort of references to cloudy symbols of high romance, about the chameleon poet, about the inability to find the poet in his work, this is something that complements that image of life and death. Keats has been memorialized, his life with Fanny Brawne in particular, in the 2009 feature film Bright Star, which was directed by Jane Campion, if you're interested in learning more about Keats. Clare is also a really important figure in thinking about mortality and the place of the poet in the natural world. His schooling ended when he was 12, and he began working as a farm laborer. And he's been called the poorest and the craziest of the living poets, though his reputation has been challenged by critics since, who want to sort of think about this genius beneath the madness. He was indeed poor. To get a sense of how poor he was, he made his own paper out of birch bark and his own ink by mixing nuts, stone, and copper into rainwater, which complements Keats's tombstone imagery. In 1820, he found fame in his first volume, Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery. He signed his poems The North Hampshire Peasant, and is called the peasant poet for his ability to express this intimate connection between the natural world and human beings. "I found the poems in the fields and only wrote them down." This idea that the peasant poet is this conduit that speaks for nature. And so God and nature kind of become one in his poetry. What we find in I Am is quite similar to some of the language that Clare uses in letters. For example, this was to his editor, and he tells his editor that I live here among the ignorant, like a lost man. And so these images will come up in I Am, where he begins to use the dominant metaphor of the shipwreck to show this kind of dream of escape from confinement. And he ends up in this place we've never seen before. I long for scenes in the third stanza where man hath never trod, a place where woman never smiled or wept. So we've got the sort of the shipwreck imagery of the first stanza, the purgatory of the third, and this final place that isn't necessarily heaven but isn't earth. His biographers have said that this is a voice not of madness but of quiet despair. And when he was put into an asylum, he lost some of the connection that he had with nature and became kind of distant from his poetry, even though he continued to write throughout his lifetime. The two, and this is his gravestone, which actually has the peasant poet on it. The two remaining poems for this week, Dunbar's Sympathy, was published in 1899 and includes a now familiar reference to the caged bird. Sympathy is a successful poem in its own right, but it's probably most familiar to readers today through Maya Angelou's borrowing of its final lines, I know why the caged bird sings. Maya Angelou, we began this class with her human family, and so one thing you could think about in your post for this week is what do these poems say, these two poems say about otherness, about race, and about human endurance and survival. Sort of this is something a theme that continues to come up, but we haven't really explored fully in this class, so it could be something that you discuss in your post this week.